Anchor text. Cowboy Bart by Chris Stevens. Bart could hear Ma and Pa talking in the kitchen. Pa was explaining that Bart was now old enough to join the cattle drive. Ma wasn't so sure. What if the boy got sick or fell off his horse? Her voice sounded high and anxious, but Pa had a low, soothing tone. When Bart came back from feeding the horses, it was decided. He would join Pa's crew on the cattle drive to Miles City. Ma stood on the porch, looking worried. Bart's brother Jim was smiling at him. "You're going to be a regular cowboy, Bart," Jim said. "I am one already," Bart replied. "We'll see about that," Pa said simply. The next morning, all of the horses were saddled up outside the barn. The day was already hot, and some of the cowboys had their hats tipped back on their heads. Bart walked over to the barn and stood next to Jim. Jim was his older brother, but the youngest cowboy. He looked after the horses. He always gave Bart a big smile. Pa was sitting on his horse in front of the crew. His hat was off. His hair was slick and black. "Boys, we got a new member of the crew this year. He's going to help out. You let him know what you need." Jim turned to Bart. "I need a left-handed rope, Bart. Can you fetch me one?" Bart didn't know what Jim meant, so he didn't move. "Well, I guess you must be right-handed then," Jim said. All of the cowboys laughed. Even Pa smiled. The cowboys drove the herd out of the valley and onto the open prairie. The cowboys rode on each side of the herd. They kept the herd in line and moving forward. When a cow strayed from the herd, a cowboy rode towards it. He shouted or whistled. He moved his horse to the outside of the stray cow. Then he turned it back to the herd. Pa rode on ahead to find the way. Bart was told to stay back with the boys. He kept his horse moving, as Jim had told him. The dust made it hard to see. It rose above the herd and even blocked out the sun. Bart kept his eye on Jim's horse. He did what Jim did. He didn't want to ride into the herd and get trampled. When they reached the river, they stopped to let the cattle drink. Bart saw a young cow run from the herd and into some trees by the river. Pa pointed and shouted, "You got a stray one, Jim. You can give him a hand, Bart." Jim smiled at Bart and said, "Just you do what I do, little man." He gave his horse a quick kick and followed the cow down the steep slope and into the timber. Bart moved his horse to the edge of the slope and started down slowly. Suddenly, Bart heard the bushes rustle and the cow mooing loudly. The cow shot out of the trees, followed by Jim hanging onto his horse in fear. Behind them was a large bear, its huge mouth open in a roar. Bart pulled his horse away quickly. He noticed all of the cowboys laughing. "Just do what Jim does," Pa laughed. In the evening, Bart helped Pablo, the cook. Bart kept the fire going, while Pablo took all of the supplies out of the wagon. Pablo talked while he clattered the pots and pans, and he winked at Bart. "Good food makes a good drive, young fellow. You don't forget that." When the biscuits and beans were ready, Pablo hit a large iron triangle with a metal spoon. "Come and get it, boys!" The cowboys sat around the fire eating. Then they had their coffee and talked about the day. "No cows lost," Pa announced. "That was a good first day, boys." In the morning, Bart helped Pablo pack the wagon. The morning was bright and the river shone in the sun. Flies were buzzing by the horses. Bart noticed 2 Indians on the bank of the river. They sat on their ponies while Pa spoke to them. Bart could not understand what Pa said. Pablo touched Bart's shoulder and handed him a bag of sugar. "Take that to your father, boy." Bart brought it to Pa. The Indians accepted the sugar and made motions with their arms and hands. Then they galloped away through the water. "Why did you give them our food, Pa?" Bart asked. "This is their land, Bart. They were here before us, so we must pay to pass through." Bart looked at the Indians riding away. One of them looked young. On the 4th day of the drive, Bart saw Pa sniff the air. "What's Pa doing?" Bart asked. "He's smelling rain," said Jim. Bart looked up and saw great gray storm clouds in the sky. Then he saw the cowboys put on their coats and push their hats down on their heads. Large single drops fell first, hitting the dusty ground. The cattle still moved slowly. They thumped against one another and batted away flies with their tails. Then the rain came hard. It drove hard on Bart's hat and rolled off the rim. He saw streams appear where there had been dry ground. Lightning flashed and thunder boomed. The herd began to move faster, then faster. When lightning struck again, the herd ran forward together and wouldn't stop. Bart heard Jim shout, "Stampede!" and all the cowboys rode off at a gallop. Bart saw Jim riding hard in the rain, racing towards the front of the herd. The cattle ran in a panic. They trampled over the grass and mud without stopping or changing direction. They moved together as one large body of fear. The cowboys raced to the front of the herd, all at one side. Then they began to turn the cows. The cowboys turned the cows further and further until they turned around. They turned them around again until the cows were running in a circle. Around and around they ran. Then the cattle slowed down and stopped in the rain. "That's how you stop a stampede, boy," Jim shouted to Bart. Rain ran down his face, but he was smiling. One afternoon, one of the cowboys came galloping to the wagon. Bart and Pablo were preparing the food. "Boys, we can't find Jim," said the cowboy. Bart jumped on his horse and rode out. He searched for 2 hours before he saw Jim lying on the rough ground behind some rocks. He looked white and half asleep. Bart lifted Jim onto his horse and told him to hold on. Then they galloped back to camp. Back at camp, Pablo brought out his medical supplies. Bart laid Jim down on a blanket. "Rattlesnake bite," Pablo said. He bent down. "Don't you worry, Mr. Jim. I got the medicine against snake bites." Pablo took out a knife. Bart and Jim both looked away. Bart stayed with Jim until the morning. When Jim woke up, he was pale, but smiling. "You saved my life, Bart," Jim said. "No, I didn't," said Bart. "I just brought you here." "Well, I owe you something," said Jim. He reached into his pocket. "Here you go, cowboy. This is from me to you." He handed Bart a silver dollar. "Buy something for yourself when we get to Miles City." Bart looked at the dollar. It shined. There was an eagle on it. Miles City was full of cowboys. There were cowboys on the street. There were cowboys in the hotels. There were cowboys standing, sitting, and on horses. It was the busiest town Bart ever saw. Pa was sitting in a room talking to a cowboy with a big white hat. The man nodded his head. Pa came out and said, "Okay, boys, this is the end of the road. Time to get paid." The crew all shouted with delight. Pablo threw his hat in the air. The cowboy in the white hat was looking down at Bart. "Who is this little man?" he asked Pa. "He's a real cowboy," Pa said. "He is the real thing." Bart looked up at Pa. Pa was smiling at him. Bart found a supply store at the end of town. The man looked at him. "What can I do for you, sir?" Bart was surprised. No one ever called him sir. "I'm a cowboy," said Bart. "Well, of course you are," said the man, "just like everybody in this town." Bart looked at the boots and the hats. Then he looked at the ropes. "A cowboy needs a good rope," he said to the man, "to catch the cows that stray from the herd." "Is that so?" said the man. "It surely is," said Bart. "I am a cowboy." Bart bought a rope and candy to bring back to Jim in the wagon. Bart was happy on the ride back home. Jim was getting better. He could even walk a little bit. The cowboys told stories and joked. They called Bart a hero and slapped him on his back. The plains were beautiful as the cowboys rode towards the mountains. Bart saw eagles flying. Rabbits and coyotes ran through the grass. The crickets chirped at night. The river shone in the day. In the morning, the sky had no clouds. In the evening, as the sun set, the sky was bright pink. When Pa, Jim, and Bart arrived home, Ma fussed over Jim. She sat him on the porch. Then she hugged Bart. "Thank you for looking after your big brother," she said. Jim looked at Bart. "So, cowboy," he asked, "what did you buy with the dollar I gave you?" Bart showed Jim the rope. "I bought this." "A rope?" Jim asked. "You bought a rope?" "Not just any rope," Bart explained. "This is a left-handed rope."